I think we can all sort of agree it's been a bit of a hectic week and a half. I think that it's important now to focus on how we got here, what our strategy needs to be as we move forward, where the failings of the left can be found, and how to sort of move past those. Because right now, what I think a lot of people need is hope. I think that right now it is abysmal to be sitting here without hope. And I think it does us no good to give up when this fight is so fresh. So I want to talk first about optics. And I think one of the things that really ends up hurting the left is a sort of lack of understanding of current optics. Because I want to be clear, most of the tactics that elected Democrats take now, are things that would be extremely effective 30 years ago. And they just fall so flat now. And you can see this. You can see this pretty apparently in every attack that sort of misses and all the noise that gets brought up but never really leads to anything. So let's take some general examples from this previous week. When all of those convicts from January 6th, all of those convicted or people who pled guilty were pardoned, it took a long time for the messaging on that to really reach any sort of fever pitch. And in the news cycle that we're currently in that sort of rapid, fast-paced news cycle, that's just gone, right? There's something else. And this is part of the Republican strategy, and specifically Trump's strategy, is to sort of flood the field with things so that you can't focus on any one bad thing and instead have to sort of tack along. And as soon as you've gotten a grip on one, there's another worse one, right? And so the response to that is far too slow. Then you look at confirmation hearings. A bunch of things that get said in those hearings are things that 30 years ago would be devastating to a political career or to a public life. They're just not now. And I think to really understand how this happened, you have to understand sort of a demographic shift and a media shift that went along with it. So what you'll notice is that older members of Congress, specifically the Senate, but this does happen in the House too, can be shamed for their behavior. It is difficult to do, but it can happen. You don't really see this with newer political figures. You can't shame Marjorie Taylor Greene. You can't shame Matt Gaetz. You can't shame Lauren Boebert. And I'll tell you why. Back when older figures in the political environment sort of gained power and rose up through the ranks, the engagement they had with the public was town halls, newspaper articles, and occasionally TV. And the thing is that they were not used to constant public inundation and feedback. It was limited. It was very small. And so because it was so small, if you had any type of scandal, any type of problem, it would be all that got brought up when you went in front of constituents or when a newspaper spoke to you or when you went on TV. It's all they would bring up because they had so little time. Now, what you see is that they're much, much more visible all the time. You have social media, you've got Twitter, you've got any sort of media they record on, you've got podcasts, you've got YouTube, you run the whole gamut. You've got 24-hour Fox News. And so all of these things that are sort of terrible and career ending, they can't fill up the amount of time that these people have exposure. And then you add in the other fact that people now getting into politics really have to contend with and understand the fact that everything they do and say will be under a microscope, and there's constant engagement. You have to be absolutely unaffected by most of that to get into the game and to stay there, to handle the vitriol, to handle the shitty conditions and the sort of overt hate you get now that you just wouldn't have before. So for older politicians, shame and public outcry can work. It doesn't for newer ones. And that's something that the Democrats seem to fail to grasp. They think that hypocrisy, which is rife on the right, can be sort of pointed out and used as a sort of a lever of shame to get concessions and to get things to shift and to sort of push public backlash and narrative, but it can't. The people involved just don't feel that pressure. So a lot of the media messaging around that, around shame and hypocrisy, just will not work. But there might be some clues in sort of how they act that are informative to what will work. So what politicians now love is a soundbite. And if you watch any interview, any hearing, any Twitter, what they want is that soundbite, is a really good soundbite that they can play over and over again that makes them look superior, that makes them look like they're right. They love that shit. And they're always gunning for it. Because the soundbite works. If it didn't, they wouldn't be bothering. And you can especially see this when they're dodging a question, right? A simple yes or no question won't get answered. Because the soundbite of, do you agree with this terrible position? Yes. Is very easy to use against them. So they will dodge. They will dance out of the way of the question. Say, well, no. What do you believe in this position? Well, I think what we have to think about is that the last administration did some very, very terrible things, and it's horrible that they would continue to do this. But do you believe in the position? Listen, it's not about the past. It's about what the last administration did and how we can move forward. And that's the trick, right? Now, why would you dodge a yes or no question? Why would you dodge a question that should, by sort of default, be an easy one, right? They're shameless most of the time, but they won't bite those bullets. Because those things will work. Because they don't want to be directly tied to the position. They'd rather dog whistle it. Or they'd rather be in a friendly environment and have it framed the way they'd like. So it becomes the responsibility of the person interviewing them, and they failed a lot. To be clear, a lot of interviewers have failed this test hard, repeatedly. But it becomes the responsibility of that interviewer to look at the person who's dodging the question and pin them to it. Make them answer the yes or no question. If they are so proud of their belief that they will spout it when they're not there, you should not let them dance away from affirming it while they're in your presence. So you have to attack by recognizing that that is clearly a weakness, because if it wasn't, they wouldn't act the way they do. But that's just the part about attacking them, right? How do you then speak about your vision for something? Well, first thing you have to do is you have to be acutely aware of the fact that the way things have been done, by and large on the left, have been wrong in terms of messaging. I'm going to tell you right now, I am pretty plugged in politically. But the only time I'll watch C-SPAN is confirmation hearings. And even then, I'd rather just sort of get the Cliff Notes version from someone else. I won't watch a fucking Senate proceeding. Shit's boring as hell. Even the House is a little bit boring. So, every time a senator gets up there and has their prepared remarks, which they read like a third grade speech student, it doesn't do anything. Right? They're grandstanding, using a bunch of words about high morals and high values, and then they just sort of ramble on in a sort of disconnected way. None of the speech, with few exceptions, tends to be conversational. It doesn't carry because it doesn't sound or feel real. It feels focus group tested and generally just very out of touch. And so what you need is to stop that. You don't have to have a prepared speech. You know what you need? The facts you have to speak about, percentages, numbers, dollar amounts, timelines, and then you just go. And I know what you're thinking. It shouldn't be that our politicians have to be public speakers. They should just be good at, running the government. And that's no longer true. Because you can't run a thing if you cannot win seats to get there. And so it becomes so important to connect and to speak from the heart, to speak in plain language. Instead of giving me a 17-point plan for how you're going to make my life better, give me just the bullet point version, just the real quick snapshot of it. I'm going to lower prices by doing A, not we have a 15-step plan to lower prices by addressing this, and this. You can have those policies, and you should. I would argue that you need to have complex policies to face the complex problems that we have. But you don't have to communicate that complexity. You can have that in your plans, and you can have that on your website, but it is what you say to people that they hear and interpret that sticks with them. At the same time, you have to consider that on the left, we are a big tent party. And so you have a lot of division in terms of why people are there. Some people are there for reproductive rights. Some people are there for economic reasons. Some people are there for social reasons. Everybody's there for something, and those things don't necessarily line up in terms of top line priorities. But what everybody wants is to feel like they are doing better at the end of your term, or midway through the term, or even 15 minutes into the term. Say what you want about Republicans, but their core values are listen to Donald Trump, own the libs. And that's it. You do those two things, you're in. And you can have whatever other fringe opinions you want. That's why RFK Jr. is maybe going to be confirmed for DHHS head. Because he has done the two things. Own the libs. Follow whatever the fuck Donald Trump wants. And the left doesn't have that luxury, but we do have the ability to shift the way we talk about things and to focus on what's important. Explain how you will help people with bullet points, with quick slogans. You don't have to accept the right's framing or their motivations, but you have to respect the fact that their messaging is on point, it's tight, and it's quickly repeatable. I can tell you what they stand for. All of it terrible, but on the left, any given Democrat, it's very hard to do. And so that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, I think something we have to understand is that optics matter so much more than they have in the past because of how frequent and persistent they are. Back in the day, your optics were your prepared statements. They were the once a week you went on TV if you were a senator, and the once a month you went on if you were a congressperson. The optics were carefully prepared and crafted speeches that happened rarely and occasionally. And so a party could align on those optics because there was time to do that. That is not the case anymore. So you have to constantly be on message. And that means deciding what that message is. Now, I believe that message should be about economic equality. That should be about bringing people to a better quality of life. It should be about focusing on healthcare. It should be about focusing on making sure that your life gets materially better. Because at the end of the day, there are people who vote for the high ideals, but a lot of people vote for themselves. Whether we like to admit it or not, it is not altruism that drives the American voting base. It is rugged individualism. It's the selfishness that Americans have constantly had because that's how we were brought up. So, you have to play to that. Now, optics on the right are also really, really easy because you don't get held to a standard by anyone. Right-leaning media doesn't do it. Left-leaning media can't do it because you don't show up. And the podcast space won't do it because whatever. If you want to know why Trump is effective, truly why Trump is effective, it's the fact that he can hold any position on any issue at the same time. He can both be pro-Second Amendment and take the guns first, worry about due process later. He can be both against abortion and the founder of IVF. He can have all of the positions because every one of his voters will say the same thing. Oh, he's just saying that. He's not really going to do it. He doesn't really think that. He's just saying what he has to. They accept that at least half of what he says is a lie. And they all trick themselves into thinking that the position they align with is the one he actually has. And that's devastating, right? Because it means what he can do is he can say anything. And it does not matter to his base. Now, the left is not going to get that. Which means you have to be consistent. And you have to be consistently correct. Anytime someone from the right or the center tries to add a false equivalence to something, you have to speak back about it. Every time that you see something wrong occurring, you have to say something. You have to constantly be on message. And you have to ignore the bullshit, which is so difficult to do because the bullshit is dangerous. Now, there's another part of optics that I really want to talk about. And it's sort of a tacit, tacit disavowal of what some people on the left believe by people on the left. We had a very long run-up in the presidential election of saying that Donald Trump was a fascist and a threat to democracy, both of which are true by definition. He tried to overthrow the government on January 6th, recently pardoning all of those involved, and he is consolidating power under himself even when he shouldn't have it. Like funding freezes. Funding is the priority and the responsibility of Congress, not the executive branch. So, yes, he's by definition doing these things. But then you see not just a peaceful transfer of power, which needs to happen. As much as I may not like it, it does need to happen. That peaceful transfer of power. Had it stopped there, that would be fine. I mean, not fine, but that would be what we expect. However, that's not what happened. What happened is that we then also observed all of the unwritten niceties around that transfer of power. Trump, who was not there for the inauguration of President Biden, was afforded all of the grace by that same president. Traditional letter in the Oval Office, tea time beforehand, tours, full transition support, every single thing that is not required, but is a nicety that sort of upholds the honor of the system and the integrity and the values we believe in. But you can't say that someone is a fascist and a threat to democracy and then sit down and have tea with them. It doesn't look right, because it either says that you didn't believe what you were saying when you said it, or you're so afraid for yourself that you're going to do it anyway, or that those norms are more important than the actual fucking substance happening. That the frills matter more than the substance. And so, yeah, that pisses people off. It demoralizes people. I know that watching that is ridiculous. Watching Biden on his farewell address talk about oligarchy, the thing he should have been talking about before that, for years before that. Watching him pardon his family and leave the rest of us twisting in the wind. He knows that what's coming is so egregious that if he doesn't pardon his family, the Justice Department and Congress will tear through their lives to find any time they jaywalked and give them the maximum consequences for that. He knows that. It's the only reason he pardoned. He said it. And yet he still has tea with the man. Both sides aren't the same, but bullshit like that feeds the narrative that drives voter turnout down and makes people think it doesn't matter. That sort of bullshit messaging, that capitulation, that self-serving nature is fucked, and it does not help. Now, let's take sort of... Let's take a look at why that is so damaging, why that's so detrimental. It's because on the right, what you have is a group of fighters, at least in words, as much fighting as will sort of allow, and Lord knows if Trump got into an actual fight, he'd keel over dead almost immediately. But you have people who seemingly are very vocal about the things that they would have you think they believe. On the left, there's not a bunch of that, right? A couple of people, a handful of people are really out here beating that drum. AOC, Bernie, Jasmine Crockett, Ro Khanna on a good day. And the problem is, on the left, you just feel really demoralized. You don't have those fighters. You have people who observe norms and tradition over very real problems, who will listen to the unelected Senate parliamentarian instead of working on the minimum wage, who will make symbolic shit gestures and act like it mattered. Now, to be clear, the Biden presidency was far better than I had any reason to expect it to be. The NLRB, the legislation he got passed, our standing on the global stage, all of these things, his response to Ukraine, all of it was much better than I expected. Some of the most progressive legislation in our lifetimes. But it wasn't communicated. Now, I knew about it because I'm tuned into the world of politics, and you probably are too if you happen to be watching this. But average person doesn't see that. They don't know that. They don't see that coming. And that's the problem. Truly, it is that we can't win a war of words if people don't hear them, if our messaging isn't good. And Biden, for all his accomplishments, was not the messenger we needed. And that's a problem. But what matters now is finding those messengers and acting accordingly, making sure that those voices are elevated. And it has to be done, because milquetoast bullshit on the Senate floor means nothing to this country. when people are hurting. It doesn't mean anything in this country when people are doing well. We're past that. The country is past that. And the audience that is being played to for that is not one worth capturing. Because to be clear, if you're watching C-SPAN, you are on one side or you are on the other. There is no one in the middle. At least no appreciable number of people in the middle. So all your bullshit on C-SPAN does nothing. What you need is to bring people in who don't pay attention. Make them see what you're about. Make them see you're about them. That you don't give a shit about the wealthy, that you don't care. Because you're there for someone who needs that help. Because you want the system to work for more people. It's why people resonate. And when you attack your opponents, you have to be ruthless. It can't be that you attack with 3 years ago you said this thing on a podcast and that now disagrees with what you're saying. No, it's important to know those things, but the attacks have to be plain. They have to be obvious. They have to be easy to follow. Anything else is a dereliction of duty. So, our problem is messaging. In a media ecosystem that does not allow that to happen in a fair way. There is a bunch of both sides of the same, and X action equals Y action, and so the left is just as bad as the right. But it's not, well, it is the media's job to not do that, but if they're doing it, then it has to be pushed back. Then the left has to be ready for it, and they have to be willing to fight on those points. So, how do you deal with this? What do we do about this? So next week, I'm going to dig more into some of the things the administration has done. Talk about those things that I understand the best, because I know there will be better sources for some things. Because you have to get that information out there. But what we also have to do is we have to look at grocery prices and pin that squarely on Republicans. They've got all three branches. Anything that's not working right now, it's not working because they're not making it work. Pin that to them every day. Make sure your messaging is consistent on that. Make sure that you understand that their failures are their failures and they need to be draped around their necks. At the same time, you have to be vigilant for the worst things that are coming. A lot of it's words and bluster, but a lot of it isn't. And we need to be vigilant. Reach out to your congresspeople. I know they don't listen most of the time. Throw a phone call down. They really can't sort of let that one slide, but phone call, fax, email, write a letter if you have a problem that's not coming up for a couple of weeks. But be in contact with them, even if they're not of the same party. Make it clear to them that your support or lack of support depends upon them doing what is right. And for the love of God, run some cover for people on the left. Have some support for them. Call them when they're wrong, but when they're right, line up behind them, even if you don't necessarily agree with their particular niche issues. We have to work together. This gets done together or it doesn't get done. Don't give up. Right? This is a scary time, but you don't comply in advance and you don't give away to them by giving up and consenting. Be loud about it. Do not be cowed by threats. Argue for what you believe in. If you can run for office, do. If you can't support someone who does, join your local Democratic parties. Because again, like I said last time, we don't get a voice if we're not in the room. So we got to be in the room. Sort of wrap it up. I think it's important to remember that this is the first couple of weeks of a fight that will last years. Don't burn yourself out right now. Take some time if you need it. Disconnect if you have to, but remember, we have to work together. We have to be willing to fight if we want things to change. They won't change if we're not changing them. So, let's see what we can do. I will see you next week. Stay safe.